what I'm going to say is going to upset you. And so I want you to remember that I'm just the messenger. I didn't make these things happen, but I do want to honestly tell you, because we live now in a weird time, weirder and in different ways from what we were used to. This country is in a time of decline. And when an empire declines, which is something we haven't gone through because empires don't decline very often, but let me tell you from the history books, a little bit we can tell, it's not fun to be in a declining empire. Much more fun when the empire is going up, which was the last century or a century and a half of this country, the ride up. We are now on the ride down. We haven't been prepared because we have leaders who cannot say a word about that. I want to just drive that home because the split in this country is really about that. So let me start with the split in the obvious way. And that split is everywhere now. And if you haven't noticed it yet, you will, because it's going to impact your life in all kinds of ways. So one of them is a little bit about what a declining empire means, just to give you the context. The United States lost the war in Vietnam. When I say that in my classes, my students look at me. They never heard such a thought. America, as they know from the comic books they read as children, only wins wars. It doesn't lose wars, but we lost. The war was fought against the Communist Party of North Vietnam, which has been running that country since the United States was driven out in 1975. Go check all of this. You will find I'm not making it up. After we lost the war in Vietnam, we went and had a big war in Afghanistan, which we also lost. That war was against the Taliban, which now runs that country. It's a good sign that you lost. We lost the war in Iraq. We are in the process of losing the war in Ukraine. If I were in certain audiences, I wouldn't dare say what I just said, because they couldn't hear it. They could not hear it. But it is the reality. Let me give you a couple of more, just bits of getting what decline means. Last week, something happened on the part of a country called Indonesia. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a remarkable country in Asia, made up of 18,000 islands in the Pacific. It's a huge country. The population of Indonesia is 280 million people. Makes it one of the largest countries in the world. Let me remind you, the population of the United States is 330 million. 280 isn't that far less than 330. It's an enormous thing what they did. They joined the BRICS. They joined a full partner of the BRICS. BRICS, by the way, means it's the first letters of the countries Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. A dozen years ago, they began to form an alliance of what came to be called the Global South, to be independent, relatively, from the domination of the United States. And the core economy there, the biggest one, the most powerful, is, I'm sorry to tell you this, I know it'll come as an upset, the People's Republic of China. Remember, I'm the messenger. I have no responsibility for this at all. China and the BRICS, Indonesia joined them. Together now, the BRICS, built around China, have as the population of the countries that are part of the BRICS, about 22 countries now altogether. They have about 55 to 60% of the population of the world are members. What is the percentage of the world's population of the United States? 4.5%. You understand? We are 4.5%. They are 50 to 60%. In the words of Mickey Mouse, those odds are not so good, no matter how you cut it. And as a group, let me tell you how you cut it. We in economics have this little game. We ask, what is the total output in goods and services in a year of a country? Gives us a kind of rough idea of how big a country it is, how important its footprint is in the world. Okay, so if you take the BRICS together now, they are about 35%, maybe a bit more, total output of the world. If you add up each of those countries' total output in a year, and you add them up, they account for 36%, more or less, of the world's output. Now let's compare that to the United States and its major allies. Those are called the G7, the group of seven. United States, Japan, Canada, Britain, France, Italy, and Spain. Okay, that used to be the dominant player of the world. That used to be what world trade meant, what they did. Together they, that's all of them, now account for about 28% of the world's output. Do you understand? The BRICS is now what the United States was, but is no more. Now, if you're looking to where the wealth is, you go east, not west. If you're a poor third world country, as we used to call them, and you need money for a build railroad, or you need to find places to sell your exports, you direct your diplomats first to go to Beijing, because that's where it's at. If you can't get a good deal there, well, you might go to London or Washington. But whatever you are doing, you're going to play them against each other. You're going to say to the Americans, oh, that's the best you offer? Let's go the other place, see what they offer. You want to know why most of the railroads being built in Africa today are being built by the Chinese? There's your answer. They got a better deal. Everything is changing because of this, except here, where the make-believe is the way this country is dealing with this. Denial. We all know it from our personal lives, right? When we've lost a friend or a lover, and we had to wait until all our friends told us we couldn't face ourselves. Well, we are the friends in this country who are being unable to vent. That's why what Indonesia did last week is something I'm not going to ask how many of you noticed it, because nobody will raise their hand. How could you? Make-believe made sure that that was not on the newspaper's front page or in most newspapers on any page ever. How many of you know that the Chinese are now the fast-growing dominant economy in the world? We're not. We haven't been for a while. Every major high-tech firm in this country has an analog in China. When we heard earlier that there was an offer by China and by Russia to work with the United States earlier, which the United States turned down, that's part of denial. They didn't just turn it down then, they turned it down now. One more example, and then I'll stop and tell you what this all means. 15 years ago, every automobile company on this planet went to work trying to develop what they understood was the next wave in that business, which was putting aside the gasoline-powered car and substituting an electric-operated car or truck. By the way, not a rational response, because it's terribly wasteful to have that vehicle, which those of you who have it notice, sits on the street or in the garage most of its life. That's kind of, let's use a fundamental word, stupid. It's stupid. It's a waste of resources. That car could serve 20 people each day if it were managed properly. What do I mean managed properly? Well, like a car rental business, that's how they would manage that. Or those bicycles we can now just take off the rack and put back on. That's a rational way. If you want to avoid killing people, which private cars do, if you want to avoid air pollution, cars are the major cause of it, and on and on. Rational would be to go from the private car to a mass transit efficient system. A beautiful train every 5 minutes, a beautiful bus, even more beautiful, every 3 minutes, everywhere. That's it. Infinitely cheaper, much more efficient. And none of you have to worry about it, because wherever it's parked, in the central lots, which we call car rental centers, there would be paid mechanics who make sure they're in proper condition. So the car would be in better shape, better cared for. The whole thing is nuts. And who is the person who invented this crazy bad solution to the fuel-burning car? That genius who did this terrible thing? Elon Musk. That's what he did. He found a way that automobile companies could make a profit by taking us out of gas cars into electric cars. So 15 years ago, all the car companies said, hooray, here's how we hold on to our profits by making these private cars for everybody. And they all went to work to compete. And there was a winner. As of 3 years ago, one company figured out how to make the best quality electric cars and trucks at the lowest price, which is what competition is supposed to result. And I'm sure you all know the name of this company. It's the BYD Corporation. Now, your faces give you away. You never heard of this place or this thing. What is it? Well, what did I just tell you? They won the competition for the entire new wave of cars and trucks moving across this planet every day by the millions. And you never heard of them. Why? Because they move everywhere except here. If you go to Europe right now, you'll see them all over the roads. BYD, and by the way, there's several Chinese car companies. They're not the only one. They're just the ones who did it best. Why don't you see them? Because we have a tariff started by Mr. Trump, raised by Mr. Biden. The tariff on the Chinese electric vehicles is 100%. So let me explain quickly what that means. The Chinese produce this wonderful thing, this electric vehicle, and let's take a simple number. $30,000 is what they cost for the car. You're an American. You need, therefore, to come up with $30,000 if, for example, you're a company that uses electric trucks to do part of your business. It's an input. You'd have to come up with $30,000 to get the truck. And then you'd have to pay 100%. Another $30,000 will go into Uncle Sam, who put the tariff. Tariff is just a word for a tax. It's a word for a tax on an imported good or a service, something that's produced out of the country but brought in here for sale. That's what an import is, and tariff is the name of the tax you put on imports. We have been putting taxes on imports as a nation from the beginning. Throughout the history, there's nothing new about it. But it's 100%, which means an American would have to buy that truck by giving China 30 grand for the truck. And Uncle Sam, another 30 grand, and so with 60 grand, you get the truck. But of course, no one does that. Why? Because Ford and General Motors and Tesla will sell you an electric car or truck for a mere 40 grand or 50 grand or something like that. So who's helped by this? Ford and General Motors, they wouldn't be able to sell their crappy cars otherwise. None of us buy a $40,000 or $50,000 electric car if we're going to do that, and give BYD $30,000 for a better car rather than $40,000 or $50,000 to General Motors, however patriotic we might feel. And you know who knows it? Ford and General Motors. So they went to the president, they said, put that tariff there. It'll protect us. Of course, they didn't say our profits, which is the truth. It'll protect jobs. Whenever you hear a capitalist tell you about what they're doing to protect jobs, hold on to your wallet. Someone's reaching. Why is it false? Because this is a terrible act for most American producers. Think of yourself as a maker of shirts or of chairs or of software programs. You would like to buy the trucks you need to bring in your inputs, to sell and distribute your outputs. You're going to have to buy electric trucks. You'd like to buy the best one at the lowest price. Of course, you're competing with enterprises in France and in Germany and in Brazil and in Nigeria and fill in the blank. They're all buying BYD cars at 30 grand. You have to pay 40 or 50 to General Motors. You know what that means? They're going to defeat you economically. You're going to be loser. And when you lose, you're going to lay off your workers because you can't compete with the companies that can buy the biggest, the best, and the cheapest electric vehicle. Now multiply this by dozens of other commodities. China is winning. We are losing. Shh. Don't tell anyone. Because you live in a country which is pretending to itself that none of this is going on. It's either never discussed or we turn it around and we say, the Chinese are becoming aggressive in the world. Huh? They're doing what exactly we did. You know how the United States became a big, powerful country? By doing to Europe what the Chinese are doing to us. It's not new, it's not different. The only question is, why would it be surprising? What a strange behavior is going on here. Now, where is this taking us? We're remarkably alienated from the conventional Republican and Democratic parties. They didn't feel those parties were doing much for them, which is true. That those parties weren't protecting them from a decline they couldn't quite pinpoint, but they felt, particularly over the last 30 years. Their budgets were squeezed, You might have noticed that 40 years ago, the level of household debt in this country was small. Nowadays, everybody is loaded with debt. I can add, if you're interested, that corporate debt is at a higher level than it's ever been in our country, and government debt. In other words, we are a country in debt on a scale we didn't imagine 10 years ago, let alone think we would have now. There's a name for companies that have been for several years so deeply in debt that they don't make enough profit, ready, to service their debt. That is, to pay the interest and the portion they have to repay. Now, we have a special name in economics for them. I kid you not, I didn't make this up. Zombie corporations, because they're dead. They're economically defunct. You know how they manage to survive when their profits aren't enough to cover their debts? They take on more debt to pay the debt they couldn't otherwise cover. Uh-oh, that makes them more zombie-ish next year than they were this year, which is what's happening. You might wonder, who lends money to all these indebted people, businesses, and government? Well, let me start with the government, because if you thought the world was crazy before, wait till you get this. The two biggest creditors of the United States government are Japan and China. Japan number one, China number two. A few years ago, it was the other way. China was number one, Japan was number two. The United States is the biggest debtor country in the world by countries. The second biggest creditor of the United States as the biggest debtor is the People's Republic of China. Do you understand? The United States owes China $850 billion, roughly. It has to pay interest, of course, on that debt, like it has to pay on others. Which means I'm here to tell you that a portion of the taxes every one of you in this room pays when you buy a bottle of beer, or you smoke a cigarette, or you pay your taxes, a portion of that money, you should be very pleased, is collected by the United States government, not used for houses or medical care or student loans, but shipped to China as interest on the debt to enable them to build their military capacity to fight the United States. Hello, I didn't make this up. On the other hand, think of it this way. These kinds of loans from Japan, from China, enable the United States government to spend all the money Dr. Leon told us about in Ukraine without having to tax us. Because you know what would bring the war in Ukraine to an end in about 10, maybe 11 seconds? If Americans had to pay for it. But we don't. The Chinese and the Russians, and China, by the way, supports Russia against Ukraine, but lends government money to the United States, which pays for the Ukrainians. Whoa. You think you ought to pay respect to a system working like this? Think. We are in a completely different world than we once were. The empire is declining. We are not strong. We are weak. We don't produce the bulk of the world's output. We don't control the bulk of the world's trade. The US dollar, which in 1950s, 60s, 70s was the global currency dominating all others, isn't anymore. Central banks around the country, which used to hold dollars as backing for their own currencies in their own countries because the dollar was as good as gold, it isn't anymore. So the dollar, from being 70, 80% of the reserves held by central banks, is now about 40%.